Okay, so this is part two of our PowerPoint for Projective Techniques, Hood, Chapter 12. And oftentimes people ask, so why do we have to resort to using projectives? Well, it's really the same reason that many tests of self-evaluation often have a large error factor because of social desirability. This also extends to the issue of the idealized self. Um, my wife was talking about brain research. We oftentimes talk about um, what's happening in the neurobiology, the interpersonal neurobiology area, and she was talking to me about the ability to accept one's own foibles or deficits or mistakes or errors really requires sustained attention through the frontal lobes in the brain. That is, being able to stop and be able to think and keep yourself there. However, when confronted from the outside with the perception that oneself is inconsistent and often less positive from someone else, instead we access the temporal lobes in our brain, which present a more idealized and rosy picture of ourselves. In other words, we again distort reality in order to maintain that ideal self, and in the process oftentimes lie to ourselves or hide from ourselves in some way. In interpersonal research, that's the area we call the not me, the part that's not me, I can't see in myself. And projectives aid in the ability to get around this problem because they can give us information that sort of leaks out in the person's process in being able to give us information that they don't even know that they're giving us. So let's talk about some other techniques. Other projective measures, the TAT, which we're going to be having this next week, hopefully. The house tree person, which is a very popular technique. My wife loves this particular one, where a person draws a house, a tree, and a person, often, usually on three separate pieces of paper, although some people use the integrated model, which I tend to do, where I'll ask for all of them on one page. What I like about the house tree person, it's good for generating hypotheses. And what I look for in the house tree person are, does the kid especially give me a lot of detail in it, or is there a poverty of detail? Does the tree have leaves on it? Is there sunshine, or is the tree dead and no roots, and the house empty and no one in it? So there's different things that gives you information at least to explore in therapy. In many ways, it lacks independent validation. Other people would disagree with this, but that's been my finding about it. There's the Rotter incomplete in sentences blank form, and there's three forms: high school, college, and adult. And basically, it's a gross screening instrument where you basically create an incomplete sentences test, such as my mother is fill in the blank, or girls are fill in the blank, or boys are fill in the blank. And again, it's another thing that helps you for generating hypotheses. This doesn't have a lot of good validity or reliability because it's such an individualistic test. It's difficult to get that kind of data. However, I've used it before. It can be very helpful in the person leaking out information that they don't necessarily want you to know, and to be able to follow up with great hypotheses. Many counselors can develop their own, and it's often really good for generating hypotheses. There's the early recollections technique, and you don't need to use a test for this. It was developed by Alfred Adler, one of the fathers of psychology in many ways. Um, you ask the person a question, one of their earliest recollections. Clark in 2002, however, developed a standardized questions and a scoring system for this particular test as well. The person environment interaction. This is one of the ways of describing the power of the pull when we talk about interpersonal pulls. Way back in 1935, Kurt Lewin developed an equation where he says that behavior is a function of the person in combination or times their environment, or the interaction between their environment. And he acknowledges the importance of the environment in shaping behavior. And this is really an important basis for social psychology. For instance, the Ash studies or the Milgram studies. The Ash studies were, I think we may have discussed it in class, where you had a group of people in a room and one person was a subject, and you had 5 people that were cohorts in on the study, and a researcher would put on the board which line is longer, and one was pretty clearly longer than the other one. And even though that was true, all the people in on the exam or on the study would say the opposite, and basically put pressure on the other person to state that that was the actually one line was longer than the other. And what they found in the Ash studies, at first people would stand their ground, but then after a while they started to question their own perception of things and started to change their answers, which talked about the power of social pulls in the moment, actually get people to change their perceptions. The Milgram studies were even worse in some ways. They're technically illegal to do by psychologists today, although I have seen recently on cable people replicating those studies, but they're not psychologists. And basically, the Milgram studies are the studies where you have a situation where a person thinks that they're giving shocks to somebody else behind another room, and it's supposed to be a learning test, and the person, when they get the answer wrong on the other side of the room you can't see, you give them a shock. And the interesting thing about the Milgram studies is they have a certain particular point. I think it was voltage 165. And that was the really tipping point, that a person would be sitting there and they'd be administering shocks, and after a while the person on the other side of the room, which was all taped and it was all staged, would after a while begin to protest and say, ouch, that really hurt. And then finally, I think it was like voltage 165, the person screams out, you know what, I'm done with this. I can't handle this anymore. You need to stop this experiment right now. I told you I have a bad heart. And the subject turns to the experimenter, who's just wearing a lab coat and looking like a doctor, saying, you must continue with the experiment. And the person's like, but doc, they said they have, a heart condition. You must continue the experiment. The interesting thing is that Milgram's studies, he only did 21, I believe. And out of that 21, 17 out of 21 passed that 165 point, that even after the person said that, they still continue with the study, even thinking the other person might be damaged. And the people these days replicating the studies are finding very similar results, that most people will still follow through saying, well, he's a doctor, he knows what he's talking about, so I'm not a doctor, he told me to go through it, so I did. And this is how people oftentimes are influenced by the power of other people. In this, there are inventories reflecting the person-environment interaction. There's Holland's position classification inventory. There's